Hello, this is Forrest Blocker. I am going to read to you a little bit of a book that my father and I wrote about a little bit more than 10 years ago. I haven't looked at it or thought about it in a long time. And my dad passed away a couple of years ago. And I just felt like having a look. We had started making these, we sort of invented these interactive HTML books. Originally they were just CDs, and this is the version of that. We did that because my dad was an aestheticist. He studied the philosophy of art, aesthetics. And he had written a book called The Philosophy of Art, which had 101 plates in it in the original book, which was published, I think, by Prentice Hall. And when that book went out of print, rather than make a new edition and publish it as a paper book, we thought that there would be some advantages to making a kind of a virtual version of the book. Actually, originally it was on a CD, but the advantages were basically that you could have more pictures of art. And so I came up with this idea of putting it into HTML, which I was just playing around with in those days. And that way one could link to artworks that were in specific museums, and so students who were taking his philosophy of art class, could then go visit those museums virtually and look at those artworks. So that's what we did, and we turned a number of my dad's books. My father wrote a lot of books. We wrote 2 books together, and this was one of them. My father first started going to China in the early 80s, and he taught philosophy of art. He taught English, or at least that's what he was kind of hired to do. It turns out, a funny story, he studied Mandarin for many, many years, and he was fluent, really. But Mandarin is a difficult language. It has a lot of different tones. I can't remember how many there are. I don't speak Chinese. 7 or something like that. Meaning that you can have the same word have different meanings depending on the pitch. And probably not completely saying that right, but in any case, my father, the very first time he went to China, and he was teaching, I think, in Wuhan at that point, he gave his first lecture in Mandarin, and the students came up to him after class and very politely said, Dr. Blocker, could you possibly give your future lessons in English? And so he did. Anyway, so this book is about Taoism. Let's read it and see how it goes. I'm using a program right now called Active Presenter, and this is the first time I've used it. It is a freeware, and it does a screen capture as well as an audio capture. So I thought it'd be sort of fun. Sometimes I like to listen to books on tape, and I like to learn about new things, and maybe I can't really give them my full attention of sitting down with a book, but maybe I would like to listen to them or or just watch them. Maybe I'm very tired or whatever. So I thought it might be fun to read this and see what it's like. I haven't looked at it in so long. So let me see if I can figure out if my links still work. There we go. 2003. So this is a little clunky, quite clunky, the way that I have set this up. It was a long time ago, and I don't know why I have the same links here twice, but I did. So we could click here, we could click here, let's click here just for fun. Okay. Chapter 1, what is Taoism? And I have no idea what I was thinking here. This is paragraph A, B, C, D, E. And then I give this explanation. Oh, navigation tip. Similarly, you may back up to the top. I wonder if that's going to kill my video. Well, I can't get rid of it, so let's leave it. All right, then. And this artwork, I have to say, I produced this artwork. I used a program. It's an open source program called GIMP, which is still around and it's still awesome if you haven't ever tried it. Use GIMP. It's really pretty cool. Right up. So let's begin. What is Taoism? Taoism is sometimes referred to as a religion and sometimes as a philosophy, and at other times as a science. But what is Taoism really? This is a very difficult question. In asking it, we as Westerners are asking how to classify in English a non-Western thought system and body of writing. Religion is a term in English and of other European languages traceable to the Latin ligare, meaning to tie or to bind, as in the word ligaments. Philosophy is also a term of English or other European languages, traceable to the ancient Greek philos, meaning love or friend of, and Sophie, meaning wisdom. So philosophy then is the love and friend of wisdom. Similarly, the word science is traceable to the Latin word for knowledge and knowing. But coming to mean in modern Europe since 1500, an empirical, factual investigation of nature. When we look at the literature, which the Chinese traditionally have classified as Taoist, we find some passages which look to us very much like religion, for example, discussions about the three main Taoist gods, or passages that sound to us more like philosophy, for example, texts concerning the relationship of being and non-being, and still other passages look to us like science. For example, passages which stress the point that everything in the world happens by natural causes and not by any purposeful divine agency. Still, other texts don't fit very easily into any of these three categories: magic, exorcism, fortune-telling, alchemy, which some scholars associate with religion and others with magic or primitive science. Which of these three is it then, or is it a combination of them? When we try to classify anything from another culture into words of our culture or thought system, we face one of two possibilities. Either we have a word which has more or less the same meaning as this corresponding word in our language, for example, the Chinese word shan, meaning mountain, or there is a word in their language which is more or less the same meaning as the corresponding word in our language. In the latter case, we are faced with a serious problem of cross-cultural communication and understanding. What can one culture What can one culture trying to understand the other one do? Inevitably, we must use a word and concept we are familiar with in our own language and culture to understand the other culture. But this can obviously lead to misunderstanding if the two concepts are not the same or even very similar in meaning. Perhaps when Alexander the Great, who studied a little philosophy with the early Greek philosopher Aristotle, conquered northern India in the 4th century BC, Hindu scholars might have asked Alexander's generals whether they had any rishis among. Now this is really starting to annoy me. Is it still there? Yes, it is. There we go. Oh, now I have to get rid of that. Okay. So did they have any rishis? Did the Europeans have any rishis? And where the heck did that go? All right. Rishi is an Indian word referring to the highly revered religious hermits who retreat into the forest toward the end of their lives seeking mystical wisdom. Boy, that sounds good. What could these Greek army officers say? There really was no comparable tradition in Greece of such forest hermits. But if they say they have no rishis, it makes them look bad. It makes them look as though they had come from an inferior culture. We can also imagine Marco Polo trying to satisfy the curiosity of Yuan dynasty Confucius administrators concerning the presence or absence of European zi, which is a Chinese word meaning master, as in Lao Tzu, Master Lao, the man who wrote the Taoist classic Tao Te Ching. We have a long tradition, they might say, of important thinkers we call Zi, Kangzi, Menzi, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Mozi, Quanzi, Han Fanzi. I must say, I must apologize here. I do not speak Chinese. I have terrible, terrible pronunciation, so please forgive my attempts. Fortunately, if you can follow along or if you're interested, you can find some of the characters for these words and you can look up how they really should be pronounced if you're so inclined. And many others who have made our culture great. What about you? Do you have any zi among your people? Can you imagine Marco Polo's dilemma? It's hard for him to say yes, and it's hard for him to say no. It is hard to say yes, since there is really no tradition in Europe identical or even very similar to the Chinese zi. There were European saints and university professors, for example, but these are not the same as zi. On the other hand, if he admits that there is no European zi, he seems to belittle his own culture, admitting in effect that his people could claim none of the intellectual giants that made a great culture. Of course, Marco Polo and Alexander's generals could say, no, but we have philosophers. But then the Chinese and the Indians would only wonder, what is a philosopher? Part of the problem with cross-cultural understanding is, therefore, simply the problem of linguistic translation. In India, the word which we translate as philosophy is darshana, written in Sanskrit like this. Commentaries on the sutras, which were highly abbreviated written outlines of memorized oral traditions, and yet within these darshanas we developed very sophisticated debates on topics we know in the West as philosophy. Similarly, in Chinese terms, for what we translate as philosophy and philosopher are zi, meaning master, and jia, meaning school, as in school of thought. The problem is whether darshana and ziya and jha really mean the same thing, or even something similar to the meaning of the English word philosophy. And so here's an example. In this particular book, we don't have a lot of art, really, because it's not an art book, but I couldn't resist a little bit here and there as a little conceptual relief. All cultural, excuse me, time for coffee. It is 3 a.m., 3:52 a.m., almost 4. All cultural descriptions are therefore comparative. Inevitably, culture A must use A's words and concepts to describe culture B. What else have they got? In some cases, as noted earlier, translating from one language to another is not terribly difficult. We simply find the words in each language which have the same meaning. Several words for red. But sometimes we face the far more serious problem that there is simply no word in our language which has the same meaning as the word in their language, or vice versa. The Temene of Sierra Leone, West Africa, for example, pay respects to their immediate dead ancestors, that is, their parents and grandparents, but not their great-great-grandparents, which they call Moda. They offer the let me try pronouncing this better. Moboda. Okay. They offer the Moboda food and drink, and often ask their advice on important family matters. By the way, my family lived in Sierra Leone when I was a little girl for a time. And some of my fondest memories were driving around looking for people to meet. And my dad always wanted to talk to people, but he did not speak. There are several hundred languages in Sierra Leone. The Temene have one language, and I think some 2 million people speak it, but even so, he did not speak that language or any of the other tribal languages. But somehow my father managed to communicate with people very easily, and I always admired that about him. And for some reason that I have absolutely no idea of, and I guess I can't ask now since my father's passed away, but we had this Volkswagen station wagon, dark green Volkswagen station wagon, and that's what we would drive in, and we would go into the kind of the back country, and we would get like a case of canned squid, those little tin squids that look like sardine cans, and that's what we would eat. If we weren't, sometimes we would manage to, somehow talk to people from a village, and, then we would be eating chicken or whatever. But otherwise, we were eating just this awful canned squid. I have no idea where it came from or why we had it, but that's what we ate, a lot of that canned squid. Anyway, moving along, we're speaking of making offerings to the ancestors, to the Moboda. They offer the Moboda food and drink and often ask their advice on important family matters. What if the Temne speaker were to ask you why you do not show the proper respect for your Moboda? Why are you so disrespectful toward your Moboda? What would you say? Are you not really showing your Moboda disrespect? You're not, because you haven't heard of them. You have no idea or concept of them. Of course, you remember your deceased grandmother or grandfather, and you may occasionally bring flowers to put on their graves, or you may believe that their souls are now in heaven, but you have no concept of the living dead ancestor who still needs food and drink from you and who is available to give you advice on family matters. The question of your disrespectful behavior toward your Moboda doesn't make sense to you. In your world, as you conceive it, there aren't any Moboda. But when the Temne try to describe us, they will naturally describe us in their own terms, saying that we don't seem to show much respect for our Moboda, just as we will describe them using our concepts and frames of reference. So, at the beginning, at least, we, whoever we are, must use our own words with their common meanings when we try to understand the cultures of other people. Later, we will learn more about their culture, and we may begin to absorb their words and concepts into our vocabulary and conceptual framework. As we can see, cross-cultural descriptions can go either way, Asians describing Westerners or Westerners describing non-Westerners. But most of the cross-cultural descriptions have been Europeans describing non-Western cultures. Why is this? Well, or is it, in fact? So we might say that beginning in the modern period, beginning around 1500, with the rise of modern science, technology, and military power and capitalistic accumulation of wealth, resulted in a European domination of the world, including colonialism. When early Christian missionaries first went to China, they naturally wondered what sort of religion the Chinese already had. Since the late Han Dynasty, 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Buddhist religion, originating in India some 700 or 800 years earlier, had already taken root in China. This was already understood in Europe as a religion. But what about Confucianism and Taoism? In some ways, these seemed like religions with which Westerners were familiar. But in other ways, they seemed very different. As colonial administrators learned some of the ancient languages and gradually became more familiar with ancient Indian and Chinese thought systems, they began to wonder if these ancient thought systems could be considered a kind of philosophy or maybe science. Whatever term Europeans sought to apply to Chinese thought systems, whether religion or philosophy or science or magic, they faced the same difficulty. Let us first look at the question whether Taoism is philosophy. One way to compare cultures is to compare and contrast their different religions, art forms, educational systems, family practices, government institutions, assuming that all cultures have some form of religion, art, government, education, and so on. But what about philosophy? Does every culture have philosophy? However different it may be from philosophies of other cultures. So I'm going to stop there. I may make another one of these. I probably will. And then we'll start with talking about philosophy in the world. And we can just sort of scan real quickly so that we can get an idea of what's coming up. got old Thomas Hobbes. And what about religion? What about science and alchemy? What is orthodox Taoism? And what about the history of China and Chinese thought? The concept, the philosophical context of Taoism. And here we have one of the Menzi, or an artist's rendering. And here we have a philosopher, another philosopher. So I'll read that one next. Okay, bye-bye. Okay, bye-bye, I say.